Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, depending on the location from where you are joining in. This is your host, Kuldeep Singh, and I welcome you all on board on this 45-minute tightly scheduled webinar on Microsoft Azure Data Factory. So I'll be your host today, and we would be discussing about Azure Data Factory, what Data Factory is, how data abundance has become so important today with the exponential growth of data. And we'll be discussing some top level concepts, which will also include practical demonstration implementing Azure Data Factory for our sample scenarios out there. So let's get started. Without any further ado, we are jumping right into the session. Thanks a lot, guys. Let's get started. So as far as the agenda is concerned, today's event will talk about Azure Data Factory, the overview, a brief overview about the solution, which is a serverless service offering from Microsoft Azure. The top level concepts, what we discuss in Azure Data Factory in here. We'll also be having a quick demonstration, and followed by that, we would be discussing about the Q&As, the questions and answers. All righty, let's get started, guys. So when we talk about Azure Data Factory in general, so in today's world, the data abundance has become so important that every organization needs to work on the data analysis strategy. And during that process, so that the business can be able, or the business should be able to make the data informed decision, which are going to be forecasted across the data sources, and which can help you definitively for the predictive analytics on top of that. In order to do that, because my data is structured, semi-structured, or unstructured, and that also stored at different locations out there, so an ETL process is quite important: extract, transform, and load. Having said that, our Azure Data Factory can help us. How that actually works? There is a streamlined approach when anybody wants to start with Azure Data Factory based on your organization's use case. You may or may not want to involve some of the components out there, which we will be discussing a little bit later in today's slides and demonstrations. So the very first phase or the step or our Azure Data Factory journey, we talk about connect and collect. Well, as the name suggests, we connect to different data sources and we collect that data right from there, which we want to analyze, which we want to transform, which we want to perform some data cleansing operations on top of that. So when I talk about connecting and collecting, this talked about the types of data. It could be a structured data, it could be a semi-structured data, it could be unstructured data. My data could be in form of archived data, it could be in form of running data streams, events, data grids. We talk about IoT sensors, devices submitting the streams of data, whatever type of data we are capturing. On top of that, it's on separate data sources. We have multiple data sources, which from where the data needs to be collected to have an important data driven informed decisions out there. Having said that, the second option goes for transformations. Once you collect the data from multiple data sources altogether, the next important task becomes is transformation of that particular data. How do we do that? We talk about data flows. So in Azure Data Factory, we can start creating data flows, the sequential set of activities, what will be performed in a sequential and a consistent manner in order to achieve some sort of transformations inside our data collections. We talk about some external activities which can be involved in your data factory pipelines. We then move to the publishing section over there. Once you have decided how many data sources you are integrating with your data factory, how much data I'm bringing up in there, what kind of transformations am I doing over there, then I'll be publishing my changes. Publish in terms of I can use my Azure DevOps CI/CD pipelines, Jenkins pipelines over there, Bitbucket, multiple tools can be there, which can help you integrate your Azure Data Factory to your CI/CD pipelines. And if your organization's using Azure DevOps, It's great. On top of that, integrating an Azure service down there. Then we can also use some business intelligence tools, our BI tools. My BI professionals, the BI developers might be using Business Intelligence Development Studio, Power BI, views and visualizations, wherever I'm going to publish those particular data sets, the transform data to. Last but not the least, we go into the monitoring solutions. When I talk about monitoring, that becomes an important process when we have data coming up from multiple data sources and our entire pipeline is running as one. Having said that, we talk about the pipeline monitoring. I can have my data pipelines. We can have our health panels where we can see how the pipeline triggered, what amount of time does it constitutes over there. At the same point of time, if you're already working on Azure DevOps, you do have build pipelines, you do have release pipelines there. In your data factory, I have my data factory pipelines, which we will be discussing today. So when I talk about some of a quick overview, so Azure Data Factory is a tool from Microsoft, which can help me connecting and collecting the data from multiple data sources, applying some transformations on top of that. In technical terms, it could be the ETL, extract, transform, load, or some ways it could be ELT as well, extract, load, and transform, depending on the use cases. And then we do the publish of our CI/CD pipelines, BI tools out there. And once it's done, we start monitoring our pipelines, how they are executing, how it's actually working right across. So that was a very small example, a quick overview in terms of what Azure Data Factory is. In order to use that, there are some top level concepts which we will be discussing in our today's webinar. What are those top level concepts? Let's understand them one by one. I'm going up over here where I'm talking about a pipeline. The very first component over here, which talks about or which will help me constitute a pipeline, is a collection of activities which are doing something in order to have data informed decisions or data insights out of our separate data sources. Pipelines will be having a collection of multiple activities, steps, or jobs to be done together. We'll talk about it. The second one is I can have my mapping data flows. Data flows are an important portion of the pipeline, what helps you constitute a pipeline which will be running in a sequential order, the way I'm defining that. At the same point of time, I'm talking about an activity over here. An activity is nothing but whatever you're doing. For example, you're selecting data, you're sorting data, you're filtering the data, you're applying some joins, applying some unions, have some transformations on top of your data, as I can do with the data transformation activities out there. At the same point of time, when I talk about data sets, now, what exactly data sets are? Well, quite obvious when we talk about data sets being available in there. This is where my data comes from, the data sources. And in order to fill up those data sets, I would be creating and configuring the linked services. We will be doing some of these things practically in our today's demonstration as well. Followed by that, we talk about triggers, which can help me triggering my data pipeline automatically based on some certain conditions. We can talk about the pipeline runs. I can see my pipeline executions, how they were getting executed, and how we can start working with those pipeline executions out there. We also talk about parameters, which I might want to use in my data pipelines associated to those activities, some input output parameters. We'll be talking about them. Another concept here is my control flow, which I can start using, and no need to say that. Today's webinar is majorly focused on Azure Data Factory. Apart from that, we have Azure Synapse Analytics as well, data lakes as well, Azure Stream Analytics, Event Grid, Service Bus. Lots of components are there which can be tightly integrated in order to achieve and work with your data factory. We'll see some of those data bricks, for example. So when I talk about all these top level concepts, consolidatedly, they help us make a data pipeline which we can start creating and get our data associated with our data factory, which will help me work on effective data informed decisions or data insights for my forecasting purposes. Sometimes I'm doing it for having a predictive analysis, which my machine learning algorithm is going to do once my data get cleansed out of data factory pipeline. All right. So these were some of the top level concepts we were discussing up in here. Now, let me take you to a quick demonstration what we are focusing today about Azure Data Factory. We will be talking about some multiple areas about it. Number one, how do we provision an Azure Data Factory, the provisioning of Azure Data Factory. Then on top of that, what exactly linked services are and how can we create some linked services in Azure Data Factory. We will be talking about some data set examples. How can we have some data sets created out there? And once we are done with all these, finally, we will start working with some activities. The activities will help me performing some sort of operations, and the collection of activities will help me creating an Azure Data Factory pipeline. So let's take an example. How does it work? I'm taking you to my Azure portal. Now you'll see I've got some resources, some resource groups here which are ready to use. One of them is I just created a data factory resource group. Currently, it's having a storage account, it's having a SQL server. So I will be using some sort of examples out here. But before I do that, let me quickly go ahead and I want to provision a SQL database, which I can use for the linked services to get a connection to my Azure Data Factory pipelines. So I'm looking for SQL databases here. I'm clicking on the SQL database. And since this is not a SQL Server driven event, so I'll be a little bit quick in terms of provisioning this. Let me create a SQL database, which eventually we can use in our data factory pipelines. So that's going to be the resource group where I'm going to store it. What's going to be the name? So let's call it, that's going to be my GTL database 01. That's what I want to make it. It will be on the server, which I have already provisioned with a dedicated compute in here. And I'm going with my advanced settings here. It will consist of a sample AdventureWorks LT database. So I can start having some of the activities performed out from there. Let me click on review and create. As I told you, it's not a SQL Server dedicated session. So I'll be rather quick in this one and we'll be spending more time explaining the data factory concepts. So I click on create. What it's going to do, it will start provisioning this particular database on the SQL Server I had already provisioned. All right. In the meanwhile, this deployment is happening. Let me go back to my Azure portal. And now I'm searching for a resource called Data Factory. Let me go to my data factories here. And I'm about to create an Azure Data Factory here, which is going to help me understanding the creation and the provisioning of the data factory. Let me click on create. I'm creating an Azure Data Factory on my subscription. Let's go to the resource group where I will be provisioning it. Okay. The region, in my case, that's going to be East US. Let me select that up in here. What's going to be the name? Well, I want to call it, let's call it Contoso Data Factory 01, or you want to call it Azure Data Factory 02, whatever you want to name it. So important thing is make sure your name comes as unique. I just did it. I'm looking for the latest version 2 over here. Important thing, do you want to have your GitHub or your Azure DevOps integration with your data factory? At this point of time, I'm not doing any Git configuration. I'll do it later on. If you want to configure it now, you can do it on your Azure DevOps portal as well. You can do it on the GitHub account as well. Let's do it later on. I'll configure the Git later. Networking, I'm leaving it as default. I'm not doing any encryption for the data factory for the customer managed key. That's okay. I'm going to review and create. And what I'm doing now is I'm provisioning an Azure Data Factory from my Azure portal. Important thing, I can do the provisioning from Bash, Azure CLI Bash as well. I can do it from Azure PowerShell as well. I can do it from ARM template as well. I can do the same thing from Visual Studio by calling my REST-based services, the NuGet packages and namespaces. Depending on your personal preferences, the aim for that is you should know how do we provision an Azure Data Factory. We just did it. And I just submitted that for deployment. As a result, if you take a look on the notification, the deployment is initializing. After a few seconds, the deployment will be submitting. And once we come to that, my data factory will be provisioned. Okay, it is provisioning up, guys. In the meanwhile, it's provisioning the data factory. Let me take you back somewhere. I created a SQL database. Well, this is the SQL database which I created. I'm trying to log in. I can, but there's going to be an error because I'm connected from a public IP address and the SQL server doesn't trust that. So I'm clicking on set server firewall, and this is my client IP address to which I'm connected to. Let me just change it here. I'm going to say that's Kuldeep's VM. I can specify from wherever I'm connected with the date time, whatever you want. And I'm clicking on save. So technically, I'm associating my public IP address to the server firewall. So from here, if I need to, I can get it connected. That is one thing. Another important thing, guys, if you're looking to integrate this database to your Azure Data Factory, make sure there is a setting says Azure services and resources can access this server. It should be yes. If it's no, then all the time you always have to add the IP address of the data factory host over here, and that keeps on changing. It's going to be a never-ending process. All right, let me come back home over here. So what do I have so far? I have a storage account. I have a SQL database, which I just created, and I have provisioned an Azure Data Factory. All right, let me go to my data factories here. I already have my Azure Data Factory provisioned. The next thing I want to do is connect to that data factory and do some authorings about that. So let me click on author and monitor, and that's going to take me to my Azure Data Factory workspace. And it's going to launch right across in here, and I'll be able to utilize this Azure Data Factory, and we will be discussing some sort of things which we would like to have and start working. In the meanwhile, the Azure Data Factory is getting logged in. Let me go to my storage account, which is already there. So I go to my resource group. Inside my resource groups, I'm going to see one where all of my resources are provisioned. That's on Data Factory RG. And here I've got a storage account. All right. And I'm going to use it. The storage account does have some containers, but I haven't created any one. Let me create a container here. I want to call it data in, or let's call it, that's going to be my data, for example. It's private, no anonymous access. Let me create it. So I just created a container over here, and no need to say that. If you're aware about Azure Data Lake concepts, Azure Data Lake is also having us integration possibilities with your Azure Data Factory. So if I'm creating another storage account, let me do that real quick. This time, it's going to be my Azure Data Lake Generation 2. So I'm selecting my resource group where I want to create it. Let's say this is going to be Data Factory RG. I'm saying that's my GTL storage, and that's going to be ADF, DL, Data Lake, or whatever you want with the limit in here. So let's say this is going to be the name, what I'm specifying. And in advanced section, there is a checkbox which says enable hierarchical namespace. The moment you select in, this will become an Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2. Let me review and create. And I'm creating this Data Lake Storage over here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm talking about my data factory. And that's right across in here. So guys, we were discussing some of the top level concepts. Let's understand them. If I talk about this author and monitor workspace, I can start from wherever I want to. I'm specifically taking you to the manage area, and let's see what I'm doing. There is the first option which talks about the linked services. I'm creating one, and now let's understand linked services will define the connection to your data source. Let's do that. I am creating a linked service. My linked service is related to storage, and that's a blob storage, a binary large object. Okay, I'm selecting it. I'm clicking on continue. And let's say I want to call it my GTL storage linked service 01. I am creating that. And I'm using the default runtime. That's okay. I'm configuring it with my account key. I've got a subscription here. Underneath that, I've got multiple storage accounts. The one which I am interested in right over here is my GTL storage number 8. Okay, I just did it. I want to create it. Before I do that, let me click on test connection. I'm creating a first ever linked service, which I can use in my Azure Data Factory. And it says connection successful. Let me create it. So now I have this linked service to my Azure Blob storage. The type is Azure Blob. Let's say I'm creating another one. This time, this goes to my SQL database. I can see lots of connectors are available, more than 90 plus services which are available in here. So in my case, I've got my SQL server. I'm connecting to the SQL server. Let me continue. And that's what's going to be the name of this linked service. I'm going to say GTL SQL Server linked service number 2. Okay. You can go with the connection string. You can pass it up all those details. How do I get that? Let's say I've already got my SQL server here. And let me click on top of that. I'm looking for my connection strings. You need to specify the database name. You need to specify all these details. So that's the name of the database server. Okay. Let me put that up in here. What's the name of the database? Let's say this is my GTL DB01. I'm specifying the user ID here. It could be a password, could be coming up from Azure Key Vault if it's a direct central vault. But let's just say I have this password with me. And now remember, there was an enable Azure services. I'm testing this connection. Let's take a look. And that tells me connection successful. If Azure Service Communication is not enabled on your SQL Server, then every time you have to manually add that IP address from this data factory, every time it keeps on changing. Okay, let me click on create. And now I am creating a linked service to my SQL Server. I just did it. Let's say I'm creating another linked service. And I've got multiple options. It could be files, it could be databases, file system, IBM, Magneto, Oracle Cloud, PostgreSQL, REST-based examples. For example, if I'm looking anything related to HTTP, I'm selecting that. I click on continue, and let's say that's my GTL list HTTP 01, or let's call it linked service number 3. You can create it. You just need to specify the URL in here. For example, it could be anything, get or post. Let's say this is my Decode Cloud Solutions.com/courses.aspx, whatever it comes up. And I'm enabling the anonymous authentication. I'm testing the connection, whether it's validating or not. That's telling me failed because it requires the data. It cannot entrust that. It has to be HTTPS. Okay. What if I'm simply going with HTTP, the site's hosted without an SSL connection? I'm testing it. And now it's going to tell you the connection is successful. And I'm clicking create. So the important thing is you can have n number of linked services here. What's more important is what type of linked server are we creating? That's my linked service, which is acting as a connection to my data source. Great. I can have plenty of them. Now, important thing, I can have triggers, pipelines. Now let's take an example. If I'm publishing that, so this is the one, I click on publish. And there was one in the yellow, there was one unpublished object. I'm just saving it now, and that'll become 0. Technically, all the changes are published by far. Let's see what I want to do now. I click into my author area and I want to do something. You want to create a pipeline, you want to create a data set, the data flows, nothing. So let's say I'm creating a data set here. Before, in order to do that, let's say I've got my storage account, which I created. Let me click on that. That's a regular one, storage 8. And I've got a container here. In this container, let's say I'm uploading some sample file. I'm selecting it, which is available at my computer. Let me go to my desktop in here, and there is a CSV file. I'm just selecting moviesdb.csv. I'm uploading it. That contains some 9,000, 10,000 records, which can be processed whatever you want. I just uploaded one over here. Important thing, it is a regular storage account. What if I want to go to my data lake? In my data lake, I do have the containers associations over here. So I can scroll it down. I can go to my data lake storage and start working with all these container services, get them done and start creating. So let's say I'm in the container. I have a container here called data and I'm creating it. Important thing, I can add some directories inside it, the hierarchical namespace, which we enabled. Let's say that's going to be Contoso. I'm just creating it. Inside it, I'm saying that's going to be North America. Let me create it. And inside that, I'm uploading a file. It's the same file which I'm browsing up over here, moviesdb.csv. So one, it's on our regular storage. This time it's on a data lake storage. Let me go to my Azure Data Factory and I want to create a data set. Let me create one. This will be from my blob storage, a regular blob storage. Okay, first, it's going to check, do you have an existing linked service to that blob storage? If yes, you can use it, or you can create new directly from here as well. Let's say I'm clicking on continue and my data comes up from CSV, Avro, XML, JSON, whatever it is. In my case, it's a CSV. And you specified the name. So let's call it my dataset 01. Ideally, should be a meaningful name. I'm just using it for demonstration purposes. And I already have a storage linked service. I can create another one as well, but let me just use it. My first row would be acting as an header. Where is my file path? In my data, I've got moviesdb.csv. Let me click OK. My first row would be acting as an header. And I click OK over here. So technically, I am creating this data set with the name called DS01. What if I want to preview the data? Let me click here and it shows you the preview, what's being available in there. Okay, so I just created this data source, all right, and I want to make this change permanent. So I'm publishing it and let me click on publish and my data set will be created and saved. I can create multiple data sets. For example, I want to have another data set. This time it's going to be from a SQL database. So let's go for SQL Server. The data will come up from there. I click on continue. Let's say this is going to be my data set number 2. Ideally should be a meaningful name. Once again, I'm just selecting that. What is my linked service? I already have a linked service created for that SQL server, what we understood. And from that, what's going to be the name of the table? Let's say saleslt.product. And I'm clicking OK over here. So another data will be picked up. If you want to see that, click on preview the data. And now your data is going to be fetched up from that SQL Server table, which is available with all these rows and columns associated in here. So I can see the data being available. Great. So this is some of the examples, guys, what we were discussing as the top level concepts. We can have the linked services, we can have the data sets, we can have the connections out there. On top of that, we can have some activities, we can have some pipelines. That's okay. I just created two data sets over here. Now let's see what I'm doing next. I'm creating a pipeline here. So let me create a new pipeline. And pipeline, I want to call it, let's say my pipeline 01 or 1, whatever you want to name it. Now I would like to design it. So let's take an example here. This is my pipeline. And these are the list of activities which you can add: transformation activities, data explorers, Azure functions, batch service, Azure Databricks, data lake analytics, Hadoop insight clusters, Hive query, BigQuery, iterations, switch case, loops, if else. You can do all these things coming up from there. Let's say what I'm doing here. I'm saying I want to create a data flow here. Okay, now what my data flow is going to do, I can specify that. That's my data flow number 1. I can specify the settings, that from where the data flow is going to come, how it's going to work. Let me click on new and see. Now I'm creating my data flow activities. So when I come back over here, I can start adding a source first where my data is. Let's say I'm saying your data lies in a data set. That's my DS01, which is a CSV file, a DS02, which is a SQL server. It can be coming up from SAP, Oracle, Salesforce, Dynamics 365, HTTP source, Azure function app, lots of connectors, link services can be there. Let's say I'm selecting the first one. Okay, I can test the connections, no problem on that. Important thing is, once I specify that, I want to see the preview of the data. In order to do that, your debugging has to be turned on. So what you do, you turn on the data flow debugger. It will call off the cluster after 2 hours of inactivity. My cluster will stop, my debugger will also stop. It may take 5 to 10 to 15 minutes to turn it on, and you will be able to preview your data. We'll do that. But what I want to do next, once my raw data comes to this data flow, I'm clicking on this plus icon. And now what I want to do some select. There is a select operator. So these are known as data transformations. Let me click here. All right. It's giving me all these. Well, I don't need that rotten tomato. I don't need that column at all. It's giving me all that. That's going to be my select. Incoming stream is this source one, and I'm selecting only 5 columns. Okay, I just did it. My next transformation is going to be, I want to go for a filter. I want to filter my data, and there I can write my expression. So you can go for expression builder as well, whatever you want. For example, you're looking for a column called year, and you're saying greater than 1950, and I just save and finish. So I just added one column over here. I want to consider it as an integer, or I can convert that column back in here as integer as well. So important thing is you can do whatever transformations you want. For example, here, when you are selecting that particular data, you can specify these are my mappings, and you can change those mappings that it's going to be a string. You want to have it as integer. You can do those manual mappings as well, but that's okay. I just did the select. Let's say what I'm doing next. I want to go for join to a different data, conditional split, aggregation, order by, rank function, sort. Let's say I'm looking for sorting. I want to perform a data sort over here. Okay. Now my data will be sorted on a column, and that's going to be my title in descending order. That's how my data is going to be sorting. That's the first sorting what I'm doing. Nulls will be first or nulls will be last. You can specify that as well. Important thing, you can add as many transformations as you want. What is more important, once you're done with them, you have to finally sync it somewhere. So when I say sync, where your data will be dumped, and that's an important activity, what you always do in your Azure Data Factory pipelines. Once I click on that sync, I want to sync it to my data source 01, or let's say I want to create a new one here, and that will be to my data lake generation 2. Okay, let me continue that. It will be in a CSV file, of course, the transformed file. The name's going to be a data source for out, ds out01. And I'm creating a new linked service since it's a data lake account. Let me go here. I'm looking for the subscription. I've got my data lake DL2, which I created. I'm creating this linked service first. Let me test the connection. It's working up. Let me click on create. I'm just doing it. It's creating a linked service. And now I can specify where exactly inside my data. You will see I've got Contoso, I've got North America, and that's where I want to put up my data in there. I can specify all that. First row would be as a header. And let me click OK. That's where I want to sync this particular data in there. My data will be transformed. Will all these transformations will happen? It's just a small example. It could be a list of 300 different transformations across 20 different sources down there. And then I'm finally syncing it somewhere. Okay. The moment I do, I click on publish. I want to make sure I don't have any errors. I click on publish here. And that's telling me it's changing the publish to the data factory. And my data flow debugger is turned on. It's working up, turning on the debugger. Once your changes are published and all the changes are succeeded, I want to go to my pipeline. That's where I did. I want to run it. I can always do. You can specify these parameters. If there are some parameters which needs to be supplied, you can see all these options in here. That's okay. At any point of time, I click on validate. And if you're not seeing anything on the right, you're absolutely good. You're good to go in terms of you don't have any errors or warnings. Great. What I want to do now is, let me turn on the debugger. Okay. So I'm clicking on debug. It will start the trigger. It will execute my Azure Data Factory pipeline. And that's where my next workspace kicks in, the monitoring. If you click over here, you'll be able to see what are my pipeline triggers, which were triggered by automated triggers, or when I click on debug, I started the debugger, I refresh it. Few moments later, I will be seeing my pipelines running over here, doing all those transformation, syncing my data to that Azure data lake. So that's going to take a few seconds, few moments here. You can see the pipelines in progress. And it'll start having those activities executions in here. So guys, that was one quick example which we did, a quick demonstration of Azure Data Factory. Though it was a limited time, but we tried to capture a provisioning of Data Factory. How can we create some linked services? How can we have some data sets added over there? How can we have some activities in pipelines and run those activities after applying some sort of transformations? These were a few of the things which we were doing on this Azure Data Factory webinar for today. Now, that's what we were having on this webinar, guys. I'm going to open the chat for the questions, the Q&A. Feel free to subscribe for our upcoming events. Just go to decodesolutions.com, events and webinars, and you hit the upcoming events section. And feel free to register for our upcoming events for Azure, AWS, GCP. Having said that, let me open the chat for everyone. Let's have your questions now. Ask your questions. I'll try to answer the maximum in this limited time frame. Go ahead, guys. Let's have your questions related to data factories in there. All right, there's a question coming up. If you have to connect on-prem SQL Server, what settings do you need to perform? One, you need to install and configure the data gateway. The data gateway will be acting as an agent. It has to be on the edge computer. And once your data gateway is configured, just create a regular connection. The data gateway will help you up setting up that and start invoking the way you want. Another question's coming up. If we want to work on Azure Data Factory, is it like a next available solution for SSIS? That's correct. You used to have SQL Server integration services, creating your integration services packages. So that's you can do all those activities with Data Factory and even more than that. You have 90 plus inbuilt connectors here. You've got Azure Databricks support, data analytics, stream analytics, we can do that. All righty. Next question coming up, is Azure Data Factory equals to Synapse Analytics? No, they are different. Azure Data Factory is an ETL tool, extract, transform, and load, do the transformations, sync your data. Whereas Synapse Analytics is your enterprise data warehousing for analytics, all app data. On top of that, you can do your big data analytics on Synapse Analytics as well. Next question coming up, what if your data is coming up from an IoT hub as sensors and we want to process it with Azure Data Factory? We can always do that. Just invoke your IoT hub, the data streams will kick up, deploy an Azure Stream Analytics job and connect it to your data factory as a linked service and start processing that data, have some transformations and sync it wherever you want. Can we also integrate Power BI with data factory outputs? Yes, you can. Once you have your data synced to the target workspace, just invoke your Power BI credentials, configure that data set to be utilized for views and visualizations. Another question coming up, what if you want to go with a self-hosted integration runtime for ADF? You can always do that. So similarly, you're having the Synapse pipelines in there for Azure Data Factory as well. You can use your self-hosted integration runtime, just like you were having your self-hosted agents on your Azure DevOps as well. You'll be able to configure them over there. Does ADF supports common data model ingestion? There is a question coming up. To answer that, guys, the answer is yes. And just a quick update, the common data model has been rebranded as Microsoft Dataverse. So the Dataverse connector is available with Azure Data Factory, with Power Platform, Dynamics 365, configure it, use it, and start having that data connectivities in there. All righty, perfect. So these were some of the questions we were having for this particular webinar, guys. I once again thank you, all of you, for joining this webinar. Keep following us, register for the upcoming webinars. I hope this will add some of the values, understanding the Azure Data Factory at a beginner level in terms of some top level concepts which we were exploring. So thank you very much once again, guys, for being with me today. Enjoy the rest of the day and have a great evening, all of you. Bye-bye.